"Remove her from the will," my daughter said, her voice steady, almost bored, as if she were asking to have an old piece of furniture taken out of the room. And for a moment, I truly believed I had misheard her, that grief had twisted my hearing the same way it had twisted everything else in the past week. But then I saw the way she didn't look at me, the way her eyes stayed fixed on the lawyer across the polished mahogany table. And I understood that this wasn't a misunderstanding, this was a decision, one that had already been made long before I ever stepped into that room. And strangely, I smiled, just a small, quiet smile that no one seemed to notice, because in that moment I realized something they didn't, something they couldn't possibly understand yet. My name is Margaret Collins. I'm 68 years old, and 1 week ago, I buried my husband of 42 years, the man who built everything we had from nothing, the man who used to hold my hand across this very table during long dinners, telling me that no matter what happened, I would always be taken care of. And now I was sitting in a leather chair that felt too cold, too stiff, in a law office that smelled faintly of paper and coffee, listening to my only daughter try to erase me from the life we had built together. The room was full, though it didn't feel that way. My sister-in-law sat near the window with her hands folded tightly in her lap. My nephew leaned back in his chair pretending to scroll through his phone, and at the head of the table sat Mr. Jonathan Reeves, the attorney who had handled our family's legal affairs for over 20 years, his expression carefully neutral, though I noticed the slight pause in his breathing when Emily spoke, just for a second, like even he hadn't expected her to say it so plainly. "Emily," he said gently, as if offering her a chance to soften the blow. But she didn't take it. She simply crossed her legs and repeated, "She doesn't need anything." Dad wouldn't have wanted her to have control over the estate. And there it was, not just a removal, but a rewriting of history, as if the man I had shared a life with had somehow decided, in his final moments, that I no longer belonged in the future he had spent decades building with me. I adjusted the sleeve of my black dress, smoothing out a wrinkle that wasn't really there, just to keep my hands from trembling, because they were trembling, though I would never let them see that, not now, not here, not after everything. And as I sat there, listening to the quiet hum of the air conditioning and the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, I began to notice the small things, the details that didn't quite fit, the way the document in front of Mr. Reeves was clipped together, differently than the one I had seen months ago when my husband first mentioned updating his will, the way Emily's voice carried a kind of rehearsed confidence, like she had practiced this moment, imagined it, prepared for it, and most of all, the way Mr. Reeves kept glancing down at a folder beside him, one he hadn't opened yet. "Margaret," he said finally, turning his attention to me, "would you like to respond?" And for the first time since we had sat down, Emily's eyes flickered toward me, just for a second, as if she were curious, or maybe cautious, unsure of what I might say, and I met her gaze calmly, offering her that same small smile, the one that had carried me through countless family dinners, through years of quiet sacrifices she would never fully understand, through moments when keeping the peace mattered, more than being heard. "No," I said softly, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. "I think we should continue." And I saw the brief flash of relief on her face, the subtle relaxation of her shoulders as she leaned back in her chair, believing, just as she always had, that my silence meant surrender, that my calmness meant weakness, that my willingness to step back meant she had already won, and I let her believe that, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing at all, at least in the beginning, at least until the right moment arrives. And as Mr. Reeves cleared his throat and reached for the next document, I folded my hands neatly in my lap, feeling the weight of the past week settle into something colder, something sharper, something that no longer felt like grief alone, because grief fades, but clarity doesn't. And for the first time since my husband's passing, I wasn't thinking about what I had lost. I was thinking about what he had left behind, and whether my daughter truly understood the man she was trying so hard to outmaneuver, because if she had, she would have known better than to speak so quickly, so confidently, so soon. The lawyer's voice continued, measured and professional, but I barely heard the words at first because my attention had shifted entirely to that unopened folder resting just to his right, a slim, dark blue file that did not match the rest of the documents on the table, and for reasons I could not yet explain, I felt certain that whatever was inside it mattered more than anything Emily had just said, more than the pages being read aloud, more than the quiet agreement that seemed to settle over the room as if her declaration had already been accepted as truth, and I found it curious, almost fascinating, how quickly people adjust when someone speaks with enough confidence, how silence from others becomes approval, how a narrative begins to reshape itself in real time, and I wondered how long this version of events had been forming without me noticing. As outlined in the primary document, Mr. Reeves continued, his tone careful. The estate is to be transferred in accordance with the updated instructions provided 3 months prior. And I saw Emily nod slightly, a small, controlled movement that suggested familiarity, not surprise. And that was when the first real crack appeared in the story she was presenting, because 3 months ago, my husband had still been sitting at our kitchen table every morning at 7 o'clock sharp, drinking his coffee from the same chipped white mug he refused to replace, reading the newspaper out loud to me, as if I had not already read it myself, and not once during that time had he mentioned removing me from anything. Not once had he hinted at a change that significant, and my husband was not a man who made quiet decisions about matters that defined our entire life together. I rested my fingertips lightly against the edge of the table, grounding myself in something solid, something real, because the rest of it felt like shifting sand, like a version of reality that had been rearranged while I was busy grieving. And grief has a way of making you slow, of dulling your instincts just enough for other people to move pieces around you without resistance. And I could not help but wonder how much had been moved in the past week alone. Emily leaned forward slightly, her voice softer now, almost reasonable, as if she were explaining something simple to someone who might not understand. "It is just practical," she said, glancing briefly in my direction before returning her gaze to the lawyer. "Mom has never handled financial matters, and this is a large estate. It makes sense for someone more experienced to take responsibility." And there it was again, not just removal, but justification, carefully constructed, polished, designed to sound logical rather than personal, and I could almost admire the precision of it if it had not been directed at me. I thought about the years we spent building everything they were now discussing in such detached terms, the long evenings balancing accounts at the kitchen counter, the weekends spent reviewing investments, the quiet conversations my husband and I had about planning for the future, not just for ourselves, but for our family, for her. And I realized then that Emily was not just rewriting my role in the present. She was rewriting my role in the past, reducing decades of partnership to something small, something dismissible, something that could be explained away with a single sentence spoken in a calm voice. "Of course," Mr. Reeves replied, though there was a hesitation in his words now, a subtle resistance that had not been there before, and I saw his hand move, just slightly, resting over that blue folder for a brief moment before pulling back again, as if he were weighing something, as if he were deciding when, or whether, to introduce it into the conversation. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second marking the distance between what was being said and what I knew to be true, and I found myself thinking about the last real conversation I had with my husband, not the rushed exchanges in the hospital room, not the quiet reassurances we offered each other in those final days, but the conversation we had 2 weeks before that, sitting side by side on the porch, watching the late afternoon sun settle over the yard we had spent years tending together, when he had taken my hand and said, with that same calm certainty he always had, "Everything is taken care of." And I remembered asking him what he meant, and he had simply smiled and said, "You will see." And at the time, I had not pressed him, because I trusted him completely, because I had no reason not to, and now, sitting in that office, listening to my daughter explain why I should have nothing, I began to understand that perhaps there was more to those words than I had realized. "Shall we proceed to the next section?" Mr. Reeves said, his voice drawing me back to the present, and I nodded slightly, still calm, still composed, because outwardly, nothing had changed, but internally, something had shifted, something quiet but unmistakable, like the moment before a storm when the air becomes heavy and still, and you know, without being told, that everything is about to change. And as he reached for the next document, his fingers brushing once more against that blue folder, I allowed my gaze to follow the movement, just long enough for him to notice, just long enough for a silent understanding to pass between us. because whatever was inside that folder, I had the distinct feeling it was not meant for Emily, and perhaps not meant to be ignored any longer. Mr. Reeves did not open the blue folder right away, and that hesitation told me more than anything he could have said out loud, because a man like him did not hesitate without reason, not after 20 years of managing legal matters with precision and clarity, not in a room where every word carried weight. And I could see the calculation in his eyes now, the quiet assessment of timing, of consequence, of who was prepared and who was not. And it made me sit a little straighter in my chair, not visibly, not in a way that would draw attention, but enough to feel the shift within myself, the slow return of something I had not realized I had set aside, something steadier than grief, something sharper than confusion. "There is one additional matter," he said finally, his voice even, though the room seemed to tighten around the words, like everyone sensed that the rhythm of the meeting had just changed, and Emily's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, her shoulders pulling back, her chin lifting just slightly, the posture of someone who expects to remain in control, who believes she already understands the outcome. And I watched her carefully now, not as a mother watches her child, but as someone observing a situation unfold, noting the details that might otherwise be missed. Mr. Reeves placed his hand on the blue folder, and this time he did not pull away. Instead, he opened it with deliberate care, sliding a single document from inside and placing it on the table in front of him. But he did not begin reading it. Not yet. And that pause stretched just long enough to draw everyone's attention fully toward him, to make the room quieter than it had been before, quieter than it should have been for a routine legal proceeding. "Before we finalize the distribution outlined in the primary document," he continued, "there is a supplementary instruction that was delivered to my office under specific conditions." And at that, Emily's expression flickered for the first time, not dramatically, not enough for anyone who was not looking closely to notice, but I saw it, the brief narrowing of her eyes, the slight tightening around her mouth, the momentary interruption in her confidence, and it confirmed what I had already begun to suspect, that there were pieces of this situation she had not fully accounted for. I folded my hands more firmly in my lap, feeling the fabric of my dress beneath my fingers, grounding myself again in the present moment, because this was no longer just about what had been taken from me. This was about what had been hidden, and I found myself remembering another detail, something small at the time, something easy to dismiss in the chaos of hospital visits and difficult conversations. The way my husband had asked me, just once, if I still trusted Mr. Reeves. Completely, and I had answered without hesitation, of course I did, because trust had never been a question in our lives, not between us, not in the systems we had built together, and now I understood that question had not been casual. It had been intentional, placed carefully into a moment when I would not think to examine it too closely. "The contents of this document," Mr. Reeves said, his gaze moving briefly toward me before returning to the page in front of him, "were to be disclosed only if certain circumstances arose regarding the interpretation or execution of the primary will." And I could feel the attention in the room shifting, not just toward him, but toward me, toward the space I occupied at the table, as if my presence had suddenly become relevant again in a way it had not been just minutes earlier, and I remained still, allowing that shift to happen without reacting to it, because reaction would have given away too much, too soon. Emily leaned forward now, her voice controlled but no longer quite as smooth as before. "What circumstances?" she asked, and there was a hint of urgency beneath the question, a subtle edge that had not been there when she spoke earlier, and Mr. Reeves did not answer her immediately. Instead, he adjusted his glasses and turned the document slightly, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the table, a small, precise movement that felt almost deliberate in its timing. "Circumstances in which the primary distribution might be contested, misrepresented, or influenced in a manner inconsistent with the decedent's stated intentions," he replied, and the words settled into the room with a weight that could not be ignored, because they did not accuse directly, but they pointed clearly enough for anyone willing to follow the implication. I watched Emily's hands now, the way her fingers pressed lightly against the armrest of her chair, the way she inhaled just a fraction deeper than before, and for the first time since we had entered the room, she looked uncertain, not completely, not in a way that would be obvious to others, but enough for me to see that whatever control she believed she had was beginning to shift, and I felt that. Same quiet smile return, not outwardly, not in a way that would provoke or reveal, but internally, a recognition that the balance of the room was no longer fixed in her favor. Mr. Reeves cleared his throat once more, preparing to read, and as he did, he glanced at me again, just briefly, and in that glance there was something unspoken but unmistakable, a confirmation, a reassurance, or perhaps simply an acknowledgement that the next words would matter more than anything that had been said so far. And I held his gaze for a fraction of a second longer than necessary before looking back down at my hands, because I understood now that whatever my husband had set in motion, it had been done with care, with foresight, and with a level of trust that I had not fully appreciated until this moment. And as the room waited in that suspended silence, I realized that Emily had not just spoken too soon. She had revealed exactly what he had been preparing for all along. Mr. Reeves began to read, and the tone of his voice changed in a way that was subtle but unmistakable, no longer the neutral cadence of routine legal language, but something firmer, more deliberate, as if each word had been placed with intention long before this moment, and the room seemed to lean into that shift. Even those who had been distracted before now sat still, listening. Because there is a difference between a document that explains and a document that reveals, and this one was clearly the latter. I, Daniel Collins, he read, and hearing my husband's name spoken aloud in that formal, measured way sent a quiet echo through me, not sharp like grief had been in the days after his passing, but steady, grounding, as if he were still present in the structure of what he had left behind, being of sound mind. Do hereby provide this supplemental instruction to be executed only under the condition that any attempt is made to alter, diminish, or exclude my wife, Margaret Collins, from her rightful position within my estate. The words settled heavily into the air, and for a moment, no one moved, because they did not just contradict what had been said earlier, they reframed it entirely, and I did not look at Emily. Right away, I did not need to. I could feel the shift without seeing it, the quiet recalculation happening beside me, the sudden awareness that something had gone off script. In such an event, Mr. Reeves continued, his eyes steady on the page, all prior distributions outlined in the primary document shall be rendered void, and the entirety of my estate shall instead be transferred into a protected trust under the sole authority of my wife, Margaret Collins, who shall retain full and exclusive control over all assets, properties, and financial instruments. I heard a small movement across the table, the faint sound of fabric shifting, a chair adjusting, and then I turned my head slightly, just enough to see Emily's expression, and for the first time since we had entered the room, the confidence was gone, not replaced by anything dramatic, not anger or panic, but something quieter, something far more telling. A kind of stillness that comes when a person realizes they have misunderstood the situation entirely. Mr. Reeves paused briefly, allowing the weight of the statement to settle before continuing. Furthermore, any individual who initiates or supports such an attempt shall forfeit any claim to the estate, including future considerations, distributions, or benefits of any kind. And there it was, the line my husband had drawn, clear, precise, impossible to misinterpret, not an emotional reaction, not a punishment born of impulse, but a safeguard, constructed carefully, activated only when necessary, and I felt a quiet sense of clarity settle over me, not satisfaction, not vindication, but understanding, because this was not something he had written in anger, this was something he had prepared in anticipation. The silence that followed was different from before, heavier, more defined, no longer filled with assumptions but with realization, and I could sense the attention in the room shifting again, not toward Emily this time, but toward me, toward the space I occupied, as if I had moved from the edge of the conversation back to its center without saying a single word. Emily finally spoke, but her voice had changed, just slightly, the smooth confidence replaced by a controlled urgency that she could not quite hide. "That does not apply here," she said, leaning forward, her tone measured but strained. "No one is trying to exclude her. We are just clarifying roles." And it was almost impressive, the speed at which she attempted to reshape the narrative again, to reposition what had already been said into something more acceptable, something that might still preserve her standing. But the difference now was that the room had heard the original statement, clearly, directly, without ambiguity, and once something like that is spoken aloud, it cannot be easily rewritten. Mr. Reeves did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked at her for a moment, not unkindly, but with a level of firmness that left little room for interpretation. "The language is quite specific," he said calmly, "and the conditions for activation have been met." And he did not elaborate further. He did not need to, because the implication was already clear to everyone present. I adjusted my posture slightly, feeling the weight of the moment settle into something steady, something that no longer required effort to maintain, and I placed my hands on the table in front of me, not in a gesture of assertion, not to claim anything, but simply because it felt natural, because for the first time since we had sat down, I was no longer holding myself back. Emily's gaze shifted toward me then, fully this time, no longer avoiding, no longer dismissing, and there was something in her expression that I had not seen before, not just uncertainty, but a question, unspoken but present, as if she were trying to understand how the outcome she had anticipated had changed so completely. And I met her gaze without hostility, without triumph, just with the same calm I had carried into the room, because the truth did not require performance. It did not need to be forced. It simply needed to be allowed to unfold. And as the silence settled once more, I realized that my husband had not just protected me. He had ensured that the truth would reveal itself at exactly the right moment. And that moment had now arrived. No one spoke for several seconds after the final line was read, and that silence felt different from any silence that had come before it. Not uncertain or awkward, but definitive, like a door closing quietly yet completely, and I could feel the weight of it settle across the room, pressing gently but firmly against every person seated at that table, forcing them to reconsider everything they had assumed just minutes earlier. Emily remained still beside me, her posture composed but no longer confident, her hands resting on her lap in a way that seemed more deliberate now, as if she were holding them in place to prevent any visible reaction. And I noticed the subtle change in her breathing, slightly slower, more measured, the kind of control a person tries to maintain when they are recalculating their next move. Mr. Reeves carefully placed the document back onto the table, aligning it once again with the others, but he did not close the blue folder this time, leaving it open as if to signal that its contents were now part of the conversation, no longer hidden, no longer optional. And he folded his hands together, waiting, giving space for someone to respond, though it was clear that the direction of the discussion had already shifted in a way that could not be undone. "There must be some misunderstanding," Emily said finally, her voice calm but carrying a faint edge that had not been there before, a subtle urgency wrapped in composure. "My intention was never to exclude anyone. I was simply trying to ensure that everything would be managed properly." And her words were careful, chosen with precision, an attempt to reframe what had already been said into something less direct, less definitive, something that might soften the implications of her earlier statement. But the room had already heard those words, and more importantly, the document had responded to them in a way that left little room for reinterpretation. I watched her as she spoke, not with anger, not even with disappointment, but with a kind of quiet clarity that had taken years to develop, the ability to observe without immediately reacting, to understand without needing to confront, and I realized that this moment was not just revealing her intentions, it was revealing something about myself as well, something I had not fully acknowledged until now, the extent to which I had allowed certain patterns to exist, the times I had chosen silence over correction, patience over clarity, and while those choices had once been made out of care, out of a desire to keep peace within our family, I could see now how easily they could be mistaken for something else entirely. "The document does not address intention," Mr. Reeves replied evenly, his tone unchanged. "It addresses action and interpretation." And there was no harshness in his words, no accusation, just a simple statement of fact, delivered with the same steady professionalism he had maintained throughout. But this time, the impact was unmistakable, because it removed the space Emily was trying to create, the space where explanation might dilute consequence. I shifted slightly in my chair, placing my hands flat against the table, not in a gesture of control, but simply because it felt natural now, because I was no longer holding myself back in the same way, and I became aware of how the others in the room were watching, not openly, not in a way that would draw attention, but in those small, peripheral glances that reveal where focus has moved. And I understood that the dynamic had changed, not dramatically, not with raised voices or sudden declarations, but quietly, steadily, in a way that felt far more lasting. Emily turned her head toward me again, this time more directly, her expression composed but searching, as if she were trying to read something in my face that might guide her next step. And for a brief moment, I saw not just the woman she had become, but the child she once was, standing in our kitchen asking questions about things she did not yet understand, looking for reassurance, for direction. And the contrast between those two versions of her was striking, not because one had replaced the other, but because both seemed to exist at once, layered beneath the surface of the moment. "Mom," she said, her voice softer now, less certain. "You know I would never try to hurt you." And it was an interesting choice of words, not a denial of what had been said, not a direct contradiction, but an appeal to history, to relationship, to something that might still hold weight despite everything that had just been revealed. And I considered her carefully before responding, not because I did not know what to say, but because I understood that what I said next would matter, not just in this room, but in everything that followed. I let a small breath pass before speaking, keeping my tone even, my words simple. "This is not about what you would or would not do," I said quietly. "It is about what has already been done." And I did not raise my voice. I did not add emphasis, because none was needed. The clarity of the statement was enough, and I could see it register with her. The realization that this moment could not be undone by explanation alone, that something had shifted beyond the reach of intention. Mr. Reeves nodded slightly, acknowledging the statement without adding to it, and the room settled once more into that same quiet stillness. But now it felt different again, not uncertain, not even tense, but resolved in a way that suggested the next steps would follow a path already defined. And as I sat there, looking at the documents on the table, at the carefully constructed system my husband had left behind, I understood that he had not only anticipated this possibility, he had trusted that when the time came, I would see it clearly, and that I would not look away. The room did not return to what it had been before, and I realized it never would, because once a truth like that is spoken aloud, it changes the shape of everything around it, even the silence that follows. And I could feel that change settling into each person at the table, not dramatically, not with visible discomfort, but in the small ways people adjust when they understand that something has shifted beyond their control. Mr. Reeves gathered the documents in front of him with deliberate care, his movements steady, practiced, but there was a subtle difference now, a certain finality in the way he handled the papers, as if he were no longer presenting possibilities but confirming outcomes, and that distinction mattered more than anything he could say. Emily remained seated beside me, her posture composed but no longer fixed, her fingers now loosely interlaced instead of pressed together, and I noticed how she avoided looking directly at the blue folder, as if acknowledging it too fully might give it more power than she was willing to accept. And I understood that instinct, because there are moments when reality presents itself so clearly that even the smallest acknowledgement feels like surrender. "Given the activation of the supplemental instruction," Mr. Reeves said, his voice calm, "the estate will now be placed under the structure outlined in this document, effective immediately." And his words were simple, almost understated, but they carried a weight that required no elaboration, because everything that needed to be understood had already been made clear. I allowed myself a small breath, not of relief, but of recognition, because this was not a victory in the way people often imagine. There was no satisfaction in watching someone else lose ground, no sense of triumph in the shift of control, only a quiet awareness that something had been corrected, something had been brought back into alignment with what was always intended. Emily turned slightly in her chair, her voice measured when she spoke again, but there was a different quality to it now, less certain, more careful. "So what happens next?" she asked, and it was the first question she had asked that did not attempt to reshape the narrative, the first one that acknowledged, even indirectly, that the situation had moved beyond her initial expectations. Mr. Reeves met her gaze evenly. "Your mother will assume full authority over the trust and its assets," he said, "and any decisions regarding management, distribution, or future planning will be made at her discretion." And he paused briefly before adding, That includes determining who, if anyone, remains a beneficiary under the revised structure. And the implication of that statement settled quietly but unmistakably, because it placed the next decision not in his hands, not in hers, but in mine. I felt the attention shift again, subtle but present, the awareness that the direction of the room now depended on what I chose to do. And for a moment, I said nothing, not because I was unsure, but because I understood the importance of that silence, the space it created, the clarity it allowed, and I let that moment exist without rushing to fill it. I looked down at my hands briefly, at the faint lines that marked years of work, of care, of building something that had been discussed so casually just moments ago, and I thought about the long mornings, the careful planning, the countless decisions made together with my husband, not out of obligation, but out of shared purpose, and I realized that what he had given me was not just control over assets. It was the responsibility to decide what kind of future those assets would support. When I lifted my gaze again, I did not look at Emily immediately. Instead, I looked at Mr. Reeves. I would like time to review everything thoroughly, I said, my voice steady, measured, before making any decisions, and he nodded in understanding, as if he had expected that answer, as if he had known I would not rush into something simply because the opportunity had been placed in front of me. Of course, he replied. We can arrange a follow-up meeting once you have had sufficient time, and there was no pressure in his tone, no urgency, just the acknowledgement that this process would now move at a pace I determined. Only then did I turn to Emily, meeting her gaze directly, and for a moment, neither of us spoke, because there are times when words are not necessary to understand what has changed, and this was one of those times, and I could see in her expression the realization that the balance between us had shifted, not in a way that erased the past, not in a way that removed the connection we shared, but in a way that redefined it, placing it on new terms that had yet to be fully understood. We will talk, I said quietly, not as a promise, not as a reassurance, but as a statement of fact, something that would happen when the time was right, and I did not elaborate further because I did not need to. The meaning was clear enough. As Mr. Reeves began to organize the remaining documents and the others in the room slowly adjusted to the conclusion of the meeting, I remained seated for a moment longer, allowing the stillness to settle once more, but this time it felt different, not heavy, not uncertain, but grounded, as if something that had been unsettled had finally found its place again. And as I stood to leave, I understood that what lay ahead would not be simple, but it would be clear, and that clarity was something I had not fully appreciated until now. The hallway outside the office felt quieter than it should have been, the kind of quiet that lingers after something important has already happened, and as I stepped out of the room, I became aware of how different the air felt, lighter in a way that had nothing to do with relief and everything to do with clarity, as if something that had been unresolved for a long time had finally taken its proper shape. I walked slowly, not out of hesitation, but because there was no longer any urgency pushing me forward, no need to keep pace with anyone else's expectations, and I could hear the faint echo of footsteps behind me before I turned, already knowing who it would be. Mom. Emily's voice came, softer than before, without the sharp edge it had carried inside the room, and I paused, turning to face her in the corridor where the afternoon light filtered through the tall windows, casting long, quiet shadows across the polished floor. She stood a few feet away, not as close as she used to stand when she was younger, when distance had never been something we thought about, and for a moment, she seemed unsure of how to continue, as if the words she had prepared no longer fit the situation we were now in. I did not expect that, she admitted, her voice steady but lower, more measured, and there was something honest in that statement, not defensive, not strategic, just a simple acknowledgement of what had happened. I nodded slightly, not as agreement, but as recognition, because expectations have a way of shaping behavior, and when those expectations shift, so does everything built around them. Neither did I replied, and that was true, not in the sense that I doubted my husband, but in the sense that I had not fully understood how far he had gone to ensure that certain boundaries would remain intact, even in his absence. Emily looked down briefly, her gaze settling on the floor between us, and I noticed the way her shoulders lowered just slightly, the tension that had held her posture so firmly beginning to ease, replaced by something quieter, something more reflective, and I realized that this was not just a moment of consequence for her. It was a moment of realization as well. "I was trying to do what I thought was right," she said after a pause, her voice careful, not seeking to justify, but to explain, and I considered her words, not dismissing them, not accepting them outright, but placing them in the context of everything that had already unfolded. "Right for who?" I asked gently, not as a challenge, but as a question that deserved an answer, and she did not respond immediately, which told me more than any quick explanation could have. The silence between us was not uncomfortable, but it was honest, the kind of silence that exists when both people understand that something deeper is being considered, something that cannot be resolved with a single sentence. "I thought I needed to take control," she said eventually, her voice quieter now, "that if I did not, things would become complicated or mismanaged." And there was a hint of something beneath those words, something that spoke not just to her actions, but to her perspective, to the way she had viewed the situation long before today, and I recognized it, because it was not entirely unfamiliar. It was the kind of thinking that grows slowly, shaped by assumptions, by observations, by things left unspoken over time. I folded my arms lightly, not as a barrier, but as a natural gesture, and I looked at her carefully, not searching for fault, but for understanding, because this conversation was no longer about the documents or the decisions made in that room. It was about something that had existed long before any of this had been written down. "You did not trust me to handle it," I said, and it was not an accusation, just a statement, clear and direct, and I saw the way she hesitated, the way her expression shifted as she considered whether to deny it or acknowledge it, and in that moment, the choice she made mattered more than anything else she could say. "I did not think you wanted to," she replied, and there it was, not a denial, but a deflection, a subtle shift that placed the assumption somewhere else, somewhere safer, and I nodded slowly, because that, too, was revealing. "And did you ever ask me?" I said, my voice still calm, still even, and she shook her head, just once, a small movement that carried more weight than any explanation could. We stood there for a moment longer, the distance between us unchanged, but the understanding between us clearer than it had been in years, and I realized that what had happened inside that room had not created this divide. It had simply exposed it, brought it into focus in a way that could no longer be ignored or dismissed. "We will need to talk about all of this," I said finally, not as a suggestion, but as something that would happen, something necessary, and she nodded, her expression serious now, no longer uncertain, but not yet resolved, and that was acceptable, because resolution takes time, and time was something I was no longer willing to rush. As we walked toward the exit together, not side by side, but in the same direction, I understood that what came next would not be defined by what had been taken or given in that office, but by the choices made afterward, the conversations that followed, and the willingness or unwillingness to see things clearly. And for the first time in a long while, I felt prepared to face that clarity without hesitation. The drive home felt longer than usual, not because of traffic or distance, but because my mind was no longer occupied with grief in the way it had been for the past week. Instead, it moved steadily through everything that had just unfolded, not replaying it with emotion, but examining it with a kind of quiet precision I had not allowed myself before. And when I pulled into the driveway of the house that had once felt like the center of everything, I sat in the car for a moment, looking at the front door, noticing how unchanged it appeared, how easily the outside world maintains its shape even when everything inside has shifted. I stepped out, the late afternoon air cool against my skin, and walked up the familiar path, my footsteps steady, not rushed, not hesitant, just measured. And as I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the silence that greeted me was different from the silence of the past few days, no longer heavy with absence, but open, as if the space itself was waiting to be understood again. I set my keys down on the small table by the entrance, the same place I had placed them for years, and I allowed myself to move through the house slowly, not searching for anything, but noticing everything, the arrangement of the furniture, the way the light fell across the floor, the faint scent of the wood polish my husband had always preferred, and I realized that this place was not just a collection of rooms, it was a record of decisions, of shared intentions, of a life that had been built with care, and that understanding carried a weight that felt both grounding and clarifying. I walked into the kitchen and rested my hand briefly on the counter, remembering the countless mornings we had spent here, discussing plans, reviewing details, making choices together, and I thought about the conversation on the porch, the way he had said everything was taken care of, and for the first time, I understood that he had not been speaking only about documents or assets. He had been speaking about something larger, something that extended beyond the legal structures he had put in place, something that required me to see clearly, to act with intention, to not allow others to define what we had created. I poured myself a glass of water and stood by the window, looking out at the yard we had tended for years, and I allowed the quiet to settle around me, not as an absence, but as a space where thought could take shape without interruption, and in that stillness, the next step became clear, not as a reaction to what had happened, but as a continuation of something that had been set in motion long before today. I turned away from the window and walked into the study, the room where my husband had spent so much of his time, and for a moment, I paused at the doorway, taking in the familiar arrangement of books, the desk positioned just as he had always kept it, the chair slightly angled as if he had just stepped away, and I crossed the room slowly, running my fingers lightly along the edge of the desk before sitting down, not out of sentiment, but because it felt appropriate, because this was where decisions had been made, where plans had been refined, where the future had been considered with care. I opened the drawer on the right, the one he had always kept organized with meticulous precision, and inside, everything was exactly as expected, documents neatly arranged, notes written in his clear, deliberate handwriting, and I realized that while the legal structure had been revealed earlier that day, the full picture was here, in the details he had left behind, in the system he had trusted me to understand. I took out a folder and placed it on the desk, opening it slowly, reading through the pages with focused attention, not skimming, not rushing, but absorbing each piece of information as it was intended, and as I did, the scope of what he had prepared became clearer, not just protections against specific actions, but a framework designed to ensure that the values we had built together would continue to guide what came next. Time passed quietly as I worked through the documents, the fading light outside shifting gradually into evening, and when I finally closed the folder, I sat back in the chair for a moment, considering everything I had seen, everything I now understood, and I realized that the decision before me was not simply about maintaining control or responding to what had happened. It was about defining what would be allowed moving forward, what would be preserved, what would be changed, and that required more than reaction. It required clarity, intention, and a willingness to act without hesitation. I stood and walked back into the living room, where the house had begun to settle into the quiet rhythm of the evening, and I picked up my phone from the table, holding it for a moment before unlocking it, scrolling through my contacts until I found the name I was looking for, and I paused briefly, not out of doubt, but out of recognition of what this call would represent, not just a continuation of the conversation from earlier, but the beginning of something new, something that would define the direction of everything that followed. And then, without overthinking, I pressed the call button and raised the phone to my ear, ready to take the next step with the same calm clarity that had carried me through the day. I listened to the quiet ringing on the other end of the line, steady and unhurried, matching the calm that had settled inside me. And when Mr. Reeves answered, his voice carried the same measured tone it had in the office, though now there was a hint of something else beneath it, something closer to understanding, as if he already knew why I was calling before I said a single word. "Margaret," he said, not as a question, but as a recognition, and I stepped further into the living room, letting my gaze rest on the familiar details that no longer felt uncertain or fragile, but grounded, as if they had been waiting for this moment of clarity all along. "I have reviewed everything," I said, my voice steady, not rushed, not burdened, just clear, and there was a brief pause on the other end, the kind that acknowledges not just the words spoken, but the weight behind them. "I thought you might," he replied, and I could almost picture him in his office, the documents still arranged with precision, the blue folder now closed but no less significant, because what it contained had already done what it was meant to do. "I would like to proceed," I continued, choosing each word with care, not because I was uncertain, but because I understood the importance of saying things exactly as they needed to be said, with the structure as outlined, but with one adjustment. And again, there was that pause, not hesitation, but attention, the kind that signals readiness to listen. Go on, he said. I moved slowly toward the window, looking out into the dimming light of the evening, where the outline of the yard softened into shadows, and I thought about everything that had been built here, not just the physical space, but the intention behind it, the values that had shaped it, and I understood that preserving those values did not mean holding everything unchanged. It meant guiding it forward with the same clarity that had created it. I want to maintain the trust exactly as it is, I said, but I want to include a provision that allows for reconsideration of beneficiaries over time, based on conduct, not assumption. And as I spoke, I realized that this was not just a decision about assets or distribution. It was a decision about accountability, about ensuring that what had happened today was not simply corrected, but understood, not just by me, but by anyone who would be affected by what came next. Mr. Reeves did not respond immediately, and I appreciated that, because it meant he was considering the request fully, not simply agreeing out of convenience. And when he did speak, his tone carried a quiet approval. That is consistent with the authority granted to you, he said, and it reflects the intent behind the supplemental instruction. And I nodded, even though he could not see it, because that alignment mattered, not just legally, but personally, as a continuation of what my husband had set in motion. I will have the necessary documents prepared, he added, and there was a subtle shift in his voice now, something that suggested not just professionalism, but respect, the kind that is earned not through assertion, but through clarity of action. Thank you, I said simply, and we ended the call without unnecessary words, because none were needed. I set the phone down on the table and remained standing for a moment, allowing the quiet to settle again. But this time it felt different, not reflective, not uncertain, but resolved, as if something that had been suspended in place had finally come to rest. I walked back through the house slowly, not searching, not evaluating, but simply moving, and I noticed how everything felt more defined, more grounded, as if the uncertainty that had lingered in the past week had been replaced with something steadier, something that did not require constant attention to maintain. When I reached the front door, I paused, resting my hand lightly against the frame, and I thought about the conversation in the hallway, the way Emily had looked at me, not with defiance, not with certainty, but with a question she had not yet fully formed, and I understood that the answer to that question would not come from anything written in a document, but from what happened next, from the choices made, from the willingness to understand what had been revealed rather than resist it. I stepped outside briefly, the evening air cool and still, and I looked out at the street, at the quiet rhythm of a neighborhood that carried on without awareness of the shift that had taken place within these walls. And I realized that while the world beyond this moment remained unchanged, everything within it had been redefined in a way that could not be reversed, and that was not something to resist, but something to accept with clarity. When I returned inside and closed the door behind me, the sound was soft, final without being abrupt, and I stood there for a moment longer, not thinking about what had been lost, not even about what had been gained, but about what had been understood, because understanding changes the way everything else unfolds. And as I moved further into the house, I knew that whatever came next would not be shaped by assumption or silence, but by the same steady clarity that had carried me through this day. And that clarity would be the one thing no one could take away.